Hello, everyone. As you come in, please say hello and let us know where you're tuning in from. Looks like we have about 13, 16. It's going up pretty steadily. So yeah, let us know where you're tuning in from. I know you folks are from all over the country. I'll start off. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the Literary Program Coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum. I am not at the Mark Twain House right now. I'm actually in East Hartford, across the river from my place of work. I just really want to thank you all for joining us for this virtual program for Sleeping with the Ancestors. I followed the footprints of slavery. First, I want to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part to support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs, and we are also incredibly grateful to the Wish Well Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. Please consider becoming a member. All members receive free admission to our author programs, such as this one, the House and Museum, year-round discounts in the store and cafe, and more. While we would love for you to visit, you do not have to be here to take advantage of these really great membership benefits. Again, you can get free admission to our author programs, and we have a lot of them. So I'll just drop a link in the chat, and you can take a look at that as we're having a conversation. Now on to our guests. Our first author is Joseph McGill Jr. He's a history consultant for Magnolia Plantation in Charleston, South Carolina, and the founder and director of the Slave Dwelling Project. Previously, as a field officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Mr. McGill worked to revitalize the Sweet Auburn Commercial District in Atlanta, Georgia. And to develop a management plan for the Mississippi Delta National Heritage Area. He is a former executive director of the African American Museum in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and a former director of history and culture at Penn Center, St. Helena Island in South Carolina. He has also served as a National Park Service Park Ranger at Fort Sumter National Museum in Charleston. Our second author, Herb Frazier, is the special project editor at the Charleston City paper. He's the author of Behind God's Back, Gullah Memories, co-author of We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel with Marjorie Wentworth and Dr. Bernard Powers Jr., and co-editor of Yukwell, Searching for Healing and Truth, South Carolina Writers and Poets Explore American Racism with the late Horace Mungan. Frazier edited and reported for 5 daily newspapers in the South, including his hometown paper, The Post and Courier in Charleston. He has led journalism workshops in Sierra Leone, Zambia, Ghana, Suriname, Guyana, and the Gambia. He was a visiting lecturer at Rhodes University in Grahamstown, South Africa. And Frazier is also the former marketing director at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston. Our moderator, Dexter Gabriel, earned his PhD in history from Stony Brook University, New York. His research interests include the history of bondage, resistance, and freedom in the Black Atlantic, as well as interdisciplinary approaches to slavery within popular culture and media. He is currently a professor of history at the University of Connecticut. His current book, Jubilee's Experiment, The British West Indies and American Emancipation, is out from Cambridge University Press. Now, we encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. We love a nice, lively audience, so please feel free to talk amongst yourselves. Let us know what brought you here tonight, please, go along with the conversation that Joseph, Herb, and Dexter will be having tonight. But if you have a specific question, try to put that in the Q&A section, just so it won't get lost in the chat. That the Q&A section is down at the bottom, sort of next to the left, closer to the left. and you could just put your questions right in there. And finally, you can also click on captions to see live auto captioning for this event. I will actually also turn those on. And finally, and most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase Sleeping with the Ancestors from our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guests. So that is all from me. I will turn this over to Joseph, Herb, and Dexter. Please sit back and enjoy.
Thank you, Omar, for that great introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening to talk about this wonderful book. Have it right here. Book that, of course, all of you are going to be very eager to click that link to get. Sleeping with the Ancestors, How I Followed the Footprints of Slavery. I was able to get this book in the mail a few weeks ago, and I read it pretty much over, I think, like a weekend. It was a good page turner. I really enjoyed this book. And so, gentlemen, I'm really happy that you're here to talk about this today. And so I know as you know, I have a lot of questions. I'm a historian. This is a fascinating topic. I live here in Connecticut, but I grew up in the South in Texas. So I have a lot of questions, but I'll try to narrow them down. And I guess the first one would be if you guys could just tell us about how this book came about, because you talk about this in here, and books don't just arise out of nowhere. And so how is it that this book came about from a journalist as well as a Civil War reenactor and someone who's worked in public history and park services? How did you come to this book?
Well, the idea for the book was born right here in this cranium. It was about taking in the things that I was taking in at the time, the education that I was getting and putting it into practice, as in being an employee at the time for the National Trust for Historic Preservation and Saving Buildings, and being a Civil War reenactor, and working for the National Park Service, and also working at a point in my life at Penn Center on St. Helena Island, and in Iowa, building a museum. And thinking about the things that I learned, being educated, learning about slavery, they certainly were not adequate for anyone to have a good knowledge of American history, especially not African American history, because the things taught to me about slavery made the enslaved people happy, be enslaved, and the enslavers benevolent. I had to purge my mind out of all those things, and being associated with those organizations that I just mentioned, it helped me to do that. The National Park Service, building a museum in Iowa, working at Penn Center on St. Helena Island made me realize that history that I was taught was a faulty history. Also, working at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens, and working for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, knowing that the ability to preserve buildings existed, being a Civil War reenactor and having intimate contact with some of these places sometimes, after we do Civil War reenactments, and hanging out on the property and going from campfire to campfire, getting in the minds of Confederate reenactors. All these things gave me a better appreciation for the history of my enslaved ancestors. It made me do the research necessary to find out that what I was being taught, what I was taught, was not true. It was just lies. In an effort to support the narrative of this being a nation of greatness, which we are. But what was missing from what was being taught is the story of the folks of whom I share my DNA, those folks who were enslaved on those properties that folks like to visit, but they only want to hear about the enslavers. They did not want to hear about those they enslaved, who, the people who built that nice, beautiful structure that they came to this site to see, are the people whose labor was stolen to make all that possible. And being associated with these organizations that I was associated with let me know that it was possible to bring attention to these spaces. And the idea was simple: just sleep at these places. People are going to want to know why. And I think the fun is explaining the why. And it's about bringing attention to these buildings so that they can in turn bring attention to the people who inhabited those spaces. And this was an idea I shared with Herb Frazier, and he got it quickly. So I'll let him take it from here.
Dexter and Omar, thank you for this opportunity to join Joe to talk about our book, Sleeping with the Ancestors. I'm a Charlestonian. I spent much of my childhood here in the cradle of slavery. And later, as a journalist, I had the opportunity to report on the connection between West Africa and the Caribbean. So I've walked where our ancestors walked in West Africa and in the Caribbean. And I could see doing that, I could see the connection to some of those things that I grew up with, those Africanisms in Charleston as a child. I could make that connection. And then as the PR director at Magnolia, I had the opportunity to write about our ancestors and their contribution, not only to Magnolia, but also to Low Country, South Carolina, and the rice culture and that kind of history. So when Joe approached me, he said he wanted to do this. He wanted to spend the first year, 1 year, sleeping in slave cabins just in South Carolina. I said, wow. Being a former journalist at that time, I was still really plugged into what would make a good story. I said, reporters would latch on to that story. So I helped him. I sent out press releases, and one news organization after another started contacting him. And after a while, he didn't need my help. He was already pretty well known within the local media community here, and it grew and it grew and it grew. Now he's spent the night in 25 slave dwellings in 25 states in the District of Columbia. As he approached that first decade of doing this work, Joe started thinking about how was he going to write a book about his travels. And he approached a couple other people before he and I sat down and started seriously considering how we were going to put this together. And it was around 2020, I think, when we started. And we put together a proposal. In 2021, we started working on this book, and you're holding it now in your hand.
No, that's a great story. I like that the two of you were able to come together like this. Something both of you have talked about, and especially you, Joseph, you mentioned, and I see that this comes across in the book, that your book is both this personal memoir, but it's also a history. And you've drawn a lot of history and tellings of history throughout the book. And what I notice is that as you crisscross the country, right, you bring up the ways that slavery is visible, but yet often hidden part of our landscape, right? And I think about my own background. My parents are from the Caribbean. I grew up in parts of New York, but mostly in Texas, in the South. I now live in New England. And there are places where I can see slavery is there, right? Sometimes it's not as obvious as a plantation. It's the name of a street. It's just my knowledge that when I'm in the Caribbean and there are these spaces that people are vacationing on, that these were places of plantations and sugarcane and all of these things. And so I wanted you to, if you could both talk about that, how you found like slavery at times hidden in the landscape, sometimes blatantly in the landscape, and how, and why you find that important to acknowledge, especially as you wrote this book, to point out how enmeshed slavery is within our national culture, within our lives in many ways.
Yeah, you take the city of Charleston, the historic city of Charleston, South Carolina. Good example. The marketing that gets all those tourists there is they don't necessarily include enslaving people. Yet that aspect of history was so important, so vital to the Charleston, South Carolina economy, to the state of South Carolina's economy. And not until about, I think about 2 days ago, they opened the International African American Museum here in Charleston. That is an indication of how vital slavery was to the economy in Charleston, South Carolina. Yet one could come to the city 10, 20 years ago, and all you would marvel over, or all that was being told to the visitors, was about, hoop skirts and mint juleps and the people who lived in the nice, beautiful antebellum houses that that front the street. But if you look beyond the house, if you can peer into the backyard, or sometimes physically walk into the backyard of these nice, beautiful mansions, you'll see the business end of it all. You'll see where the cooking was done, where the stewards were, the coachmen were, the carriages were. You can see all that. All that's a part of the story. The part of the story that was being ignored for so long. And of course, there are those other telltale signs of the presence of our enslaved ancestors. If you look at those buildings that are made of bricks that were built prior to the Civil War, and sometimes you can find fingerprints in those bricks. Those are fingerprints of the people who made those bricks. Usually enslaved people, sometimes women and children are a combination thereof. So that's another telltale sign. That's that other visual that you can look at that can help you tell that story. Or if you go inside the building and look at those wooden beams that were shaped by the hands of enslaved people, all those axe marks or adze marks that you see in those beams, that was a strike made by an enslaved person. So another telltale sign. If you walk into a graveyard on a plantation, if their enslaved people were buried somewhere in the vicinity of where you are, if you look for those indentions in the earth, because if that enslaved person was lucky enough to have been buried in a box, that box would eventually give way and the earth on top of that box would conform. And that's another telltale sign of the presence of our enslaved ancestors. So those are some examples of how it's right there out in plain sight. We just got to look for those telltale signs.
Well, in doing the research, one of the many things we drew upon was the slave narratives, the WPA slave narratives. Most people know that history. And then and there were a number of books that also help us to bring forward the voices of the ancestors. And after a while, we started to see Joe's travels kind of coalesce around some themes, such as the influence that African enslaved people had on building the higher education system in this country, and our state and county park systems. Some of them are built on former plantation sites, and also we started to see where colleges and universities, parks, and Joe, help me. What's the other one? Main
presidential
yeah,
sites.
Presidential sites. Exactly. I'm sorry, presidential sites, because 12 of our presidents were slave owners, and I think, Joe, you said 8 of them were owned slaves while they were in office.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what we wanted to do. One of the things we were really conscious about, we had to touch on the owners of these plantations, but we didn't put a whole lot of emphasis on that. We shifted the emphasis to the people who were enslaved, and we tried to tell the history of what slavery, where slavery was in the timeline at the time that one of these, when those sites were active, to put those places and within the broader context of slavery at that time. Yes. And then the other thing, which is important, very important, as Joe's, and he'll speak to this, I'm sure, he'll get to this, as his travels widen, what he started to do was to spend the night with the descendants of those people who were enslaved. And he started to spend the night with the descendants of the enslavers. And that created a very interesting dynamic that, which I'm sure he'll mention, conversations grew out of that mix of people during the fireside chats that took place before everybody, bedded down for the night in these dwellings.
Now, you guys are going all over my questions here, and touching on so many important things. One of the things, just speaking of spaces, I know you dedicate like a certain portion in reminding folks that slavery is not just the South, right? And I know this is a person who is in New England, who's taught in New York, who teaches in New England, how surprised people are to find out that slavery is part of Connecticut, slavery is part of New England. It was a huge part of places like New York and elsewhere, right? Some may call New York a pro-slavery city, in fact, or really up until the Civil War in many ways, and its connection. So, I want to go down that route, but then you also brought up something else I want to touch on, where Joseph, you've been spending time in the cabins with the descendants, right, of people who their descendants may have been enslaved on these plantations. And just so happened that just before reading your book, I was listening to a program on NPR. It's called Code Switch. I don't know if anybody's saw this recently. And it was basically about African-American family reunions, right? And a growing relationship in some of these family reunions in the South, the slave plantation, as a way to find not only literal kin, but also fictive kin, right? People who may be descendants of people you're not related to by blood, but who shared that same commonality of coming from a certain plantation or so forth. And, those who may have shared these hardships in life from a certain plantation. And so the book itself dedicates a chapter to this movement. Can you talk more about that, especially as your experiences of spending times with the descendants of some of these enslaved people within these cabins?
Yeah, we're trying to give more priority now to those places that do just that. Have the courage to make contact and communicate with the descendants of those who were enslaved at those sites. A lot of sites are still afraid to go there because some are afraid of that R word, reparations. So they don't even want to go there. But there are some places out there that are good examples. One such place is Montpelier. They're in a good place now. It took a while for them to get to this place because there's some nasty stuff that played out in public when they made a public announcement that they were going to include the descendants of those who were enslaved there onto their board of trustees, board of directors, governing the place. And then white supremacy reared its ugly head, and then they tried to renege on that promise, and it played itself out in the public. And now, they're back to what they said that they were going to do. Descendants of enslaved people are now indeed at Montpelier, the home of James Madison, father of our Constitution. And they just got a $5 million grant from the Mellon Foundation to enhance the descendant community there. So they are going to be that tip of the spear, that example, if you will, that should be followed. And there are other sites out there doing the same thing. There's Magnolia Plantation, and there's Middleton Plantation, right? Plantation where I work, where every 3 or 4 years they have these family reunion of not only the enslavers, but those who were enslaved. And there's Creswell, North Carolina, Somerset Plantation, where they participate in family reunions. About 2 years ago, I participated in a family reunion there. And what I found out at that particular family reunion, there are those of us who are receptive to such an act, But then there are those of us who don't want anything to do with plantations. I'm trying to convince them that I think it's better that we participate, be there at the table, because we need more of those organizations out there that are willing to engage the descendant community into at least the narrative, if not governing the place. So again, the Slave Dwelling Project gives priority to those type sites.
Well, that was one of the things that surprised me the most in the research. Many things surprised me, but the family reunion tradition that kind of grew out of the efforts by people to find relatives who were now free in the South after 1865, and their efforts included, as you know, Dexter, running ads in newspapers. And I didn't know that. That was, and then, people, Black folks, we have this long tradition of meeting, not every year, but many summers we'd meet in backyards, in church basements, or someone's house, and we'd have these family reunions, and that's what got started after emancipation. The other thing, and we touched on it, I don't think we really got really deep in it, and well, except for one chapter, and that's the chapter on Kingsley Plantation, but that was a bit of an exception. But we should have, if I should admit, that we should have done a little bit more on Black people who enslaved Black people. We touched on it with the William Ellison story. William Ellison owned a cotton plantation in central South Carolina. It's across the Catawba River from Goodwill Plantation, where Joe spent the night. And Goodwill Plantation is unique because it was a rice plantation by default, because in coastal South Carolina during the Civil War, enslaved people who knew how to grow rice, they were evacuated from the coastal area down near Beaufort and moved inland, where they grew rice on the Catawba River, a different kind of rice cultivation, not the tidal flow rice cultivation, but the inland rice cultivation, freshwater, that gave Goodwill Plantation a rather hefty rice industry not too far from the capital, at a time when Sherman's troops came through and burned the city. So, and across the river was William Ellison, a Black man who owned a plantation. So that was an interesting juxtaposition of two different kinds of plantations with two different owners.
Yeah, the Kingsley Plantation is a very, an almost unique situation, at least in North America, I think in English North American slavery, something you might see more commonly in the Caribbean. But you do document. I was surprised I saw Anna Kingsley arising there. It's not something I see often. And if anybody, I saw somebody put into the chat, Anna Kingsley's just the story is interesting in its own. It has so much to do with slavery and its differences in places like Spanish Florida and so forth. But I do want to talk about the fact that, Herb, you brought up your use of the WPA narratives, right? Which I saw, Joseph, I saw this laced throughout the book, right? And it was a great supplement each time to see that in there. These basically these interviews taken from ex-slaves, the last generation, in fact, of living descendants, people who had been enslaved in the United States, taken mostly in the 1930s during one of the, by the Works Progress Administration, during one of the New Deals, right? This is a way to give people work, and it's a great way it documents all of this. And I thought what was interesting about using that in there is that the book, in many ways, is not just documenting staying in these slave cabins, but you're also trying to see what they tell us about the lives of enslaved people, right? And it's sometimes important, I always think, that we remember that enslaved people were people. They lived and breathed and they fought and they had feelings and such thoughts like everyone else. And you really look into that, right? And so I'm wondering, what did staying in these cabins and doing this research tell you about the way that enslaved people worked, lived, survived, suffered, prayed, all of those very human things?
Yeah, it's what you said. These people had agency. They were human, despite what the laws said they were, despite what their owners thought they were, despite what the owner's religion convinced them that it was okay to do. Despite the lawmakers of that period making laws that was going to ensure that this thing was going to last forever, as long as this was a nation. Thank goodness for that Civil War that interrupted it all. But yeah, these people were indeed human, and being in those places, being at these sites, you realize that, especially being at the sites intimately, as in sleeping in these places where these enslaved people once pierced their minds. Was I going to run tonight? Or or shall I wait till the next full moon? Or is it better to run during the full moon? Or if you should hear a dog barking way off in the background, you may think, well, somebody's on the run. Or you think about the fact that you got to get up that next morning, and it's the same old thing. Your labor, you can't benefit from the fruits of your labor. Or if you have a companion of the opposite sex, then that companion could be violated, and you had very little that you could do about that. And if you took action, that could your DNA could be eliminated. So you think about those things. You think about you think about also a family getting on the boat in Africa, and that boat sailing to the shortest point of that triangle of trade. That shortest point is from Africa to South America. And they're dropping off a member of your family there, and then they proceed up northwards, touching some of those islands along the way where enslaved people were, and dropping off members on these various islands of your family, and bringing the remainder of you to the United States, and dropping you off there and selling you there. Imagine the genealogical hoops that you would have to jump through to put all that back together. So, you think about those things. You think about the wealth gap that exists, because the ability for an enslaver to build wealth takes away the ability for the enslaved people to do the same. And it takes generations to right that wrong. But then you think about slavery's end, 1865, the 13th Amendment. You think about all that. But then you think about all those things that they piled on with, like convict labor and redlining and poll taxes and lynchings and massacres. You think about, Tulsa, the massacre and all that stuff, all those things that continue to disenfranchise. What this project does is help you make those connections to that aspect of our history where all that stuff is rooted.
Well, drawing on the slave narratives, we did, as you mentioned, Dexter, but in the book, we mentioned that with a caveat, that some scholars don't depend heavily on the slave narratives, because there's a sense that some of those formerly enslaved people were telling those white interviewers things that they wanted to hear. So we used it, but we kept that in the back of our minds. I have to say, I used them very heavily, and they came in very handy in the introduction and creating what we call the Children's House. And in the Children's House, this elderly woman who was not able-bodied enough to work in the field, she cared for the children. And in several places in the book, you'll see that theme come back, where our grandmothers, our great-grandmothers, they were vital, not only taking care of the kids in the Black community, but also the enslavers' children. And you still see that played out today. And as a kid growing up in Charleston, one of the things I remember is you'd see white women black women pushing the babies in strollers along the Battery, which is a very historic part of the city. And that is played out even in the Caribbean and even in South Africa in Cape Town. So when I lived there for a year, and that reminded me of home so much. And there were some other elements in South Africa that reminded me of South Carolina and Charleston in particular, coastal port city, you know. So so a lot of these themes are still playing out in our society today.
Well, one thing before you move on, one thing about the slave narratives is this: they're very hard to read into a microphone knowing you're being recorded. And I'm referring to the audio version of the book. It was a chore.
Yeah, we tried to use the dialect as much as possible. And one more thing, in reading those narratives, there was folks who referenced Gullah and said, he's Gullah. My mother who came from Africa and she talked this Gullah language. And I was very surprised to see that referenced from people who, you know, in the 1930s. And of course, you know, Gullah, and we can get off in this tangent, Gullah at one time, which is very celebrated right now, was not very popular back in the day. People were trying to suppress that, you know, put that aside and try to speak proper English. Yeah.
Yeah, no, this is fascinating. I love that you guys have done a full connectivity of the Black Atlantic genealogically. In your use of the WPA narrative, I'll say this as a scholar who actually, my first work was actually, first thing I ever did is my master's thesis was actually on the WPA narratives. And I will say that you're correct. There has been a lot of back and forth about those narratives and their usability. I will let you know you are in good hands because the pendulum swings within scholarship, and we are at a point where those narratives are being rediscovered in many places and being given a new life as people realize, for instance, if you look at who somebody is speaking to, whether the interviewer is white or Black, the answers may be different.
Well,
right?
you
realize
could answer
that
this
some
question.
of those enslaved, yes, pardon me, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm sorry. You
No,
could
go
answer
ahead.
this question then, which was a surprise to me, that Zora Neale Hurston was one of
Yes.
those interviewers. And I
She's one of
didn't
the
know that,
architects
and there are
of
a
it, yeah.
long list of them. And I'm wondering whether someone's taking those narratives that were collected by those Black interviewers and seeing whether or not there's context or texture or tone that's different than the ones that were taken by the white interviewers.
I did it, and yes, there
You
are
did?
scholars who are doing it.
Oh,
They
okay.
that is something that has been doing. So just know that all this to say, you were in good hands using those WPA narratives. They are vital sources to telling us about slavery in the past. It's just a matter of knowing how to read them in many cases, right? Not taking things at face value. But while we're on this, of course, you know, I had to ask you as we're running out of time here. I have to ask you about ghosts, right? Because I was going to ask you one question about how staying in these cabins is received, right? And I was going to ask you this, Joseph, before we go to ghosts, like, how is this received, especially by other African-Americans and other Black people I know? When I tell them about this book or this project, I sometimes get, well, that's very interesting. And I sometimes get a, okay. And some of that is based, as you said, on where the plantations are. Some people are quite frank that they do not know if they want to disturb these areas for spiritual reasons or what have you. So I have a two-part question. First off, how has this mission to sleep in slave cabins been received, especially by the larger Black community, or the communities, I should say, that you visit? Is there support? Do some people ask why? And how do you respond to those queries? And then afterwards, I'd like to also, as a secondary thing, you actually talk about a ghost story, right? You speak of this experience within the book. So if you can somehow put all of that in there, both of you, somehow in that answer, would be great.
Yeah, well, I think you're talking about the hubcap barony reference, where I was almost alone that night, with the exception of Herb Frazier, who was a journalist for the Charlotte Observer at the time, and he spent the night there with me, and he told me about his experience, which I was oblivious to, about him hearing things, trumpets, something of that nature. Of course, I took it all in, and I just missed it because I have to, because I gotta keep my mind in a place where I can talk to this next steward of this property, convince him or her that I want to come to their place. I come in peace. Very early on, my very first no that I got from a place that I was seeking to stay in, it was Red Cliff Plantation. They told me no, and I just dismissed it. I moved on. Well, about 2 years into the project, they called me back, and they said, the reason we told you no is because we tell everybody no, because just as you think, just as you label what you do as research, she said, so does ghost hunters. So we just tell everybody no. Also, if we'll go back to the beginning of this project, I used to get a lot of calls from those ghost hunting outfits, those TV shows. They wanted to come tag along. I said, well, no, this is not what that's about. So I had to wall them off, block them, and to proceed on with what I was doing. Also, very early on, there were those who wanted to come and pour libations to the ancestors, and I did not object to that. Now I had to share it with those among us who weren't familiar with that process, just to ensure them that it was no attempt to conjure or anything of that nature. I've never come across anybody that said no, they didn't want to participate in that element of what we were doing. Now I've also spent nights in I spent 5 nights in the old Charleston jail. They said that's the most haunted place in the city of Charleston. Yet I spent 5 nights in there, but with no occurrences, nothing strange really happening. So if it is happening around me, I block it out. Now, some people, they want me to make, and I do, make the distinction between ghosts and, spirits and all that, because, by definition, they are different. But I don't want to tangle with either. So that's just me.
Well, I will quickly say that, yes, throughout the process of me talking to Joe, and he made it clear, we're not going down that path to talk about ghosts. However, there are several opportunities that have presented themselves that I remind him, even though you may not have found or experienced the ghosts in those dwellings, I think we both agree that the ancestors had a hand in making available some of this information, putting it in front of us and helping us bring it forward to put it in this book. Because doing research, sometimes you don't know what you're going to find. You just go out there and you start looking and you find some incredible stuff and you say, oh my, look at this. We got to use this. And it was the ancestors, I think, that maybe made it available. So.
So now I should be used to turning off my mute now. So almost at 7:45. So if people have questions, please enter them into the Q&A. I see at least 2 of them here, because I know we don't have too much more time. One of them, I guess, Joseph, you kind of touched on. I don't know if you want to go further into this. One of the questions we have from Raven, did you have any challenges with getting permission to stay at these sites? And you just touched on it a bit, but do you want to expand on that a bit more, on what you may have to go through to get permission to stay at these places?
Yeah, initially it was me making my plea, sometimes with my hat in my hand, shuffling my feet and my head down. But once I got the first few yeses, my confidence level grew, and I was just making phone calls. My initial intent was to stay in the state of South Carolina, and I told you about that first no I got. I got no that are still no's. University of South Carolina. There's a slave cabin on their property, on their campus, Francis Marion University, and in Florence, South Carolina, University of Alabama. There are slave cabins there. And of course, there's the ultimate. We want to stay in the White House. We made an attempt that was not granted. But I think now that the book is out, I think we can make a better case for places like the White House and, Robert E. Lee's Arlington. So I think that if we go back making a request, I don't have to shuffle anymore. I can, again, proudly make that request because they see that we come, we come in peace. We mean them no harm. I think that there are organizations out there that see us as a pushback to this anti-CRT, anti-woke stuff that's out there, because what they're trying to dictate to us is that our history is irrelevant. But I think this project pushes back against that, and I want to take this time to thank the National Trust for Historic Preservation for just awarding us $50,000 to take our living historians on the road more and go into those places, sometimes enemy territory, in those states that say, what we bring to the table, what we possess, what we disseminate, shouldn't be taught to our youth. We're not in that camp. So all the pushback that we get, all the no's that we will get in the future, I'm sure the yeses will outweigh all that.
That's profound. And now I have to touch on one of the questions I didn't get to touch on. I guess we can go back to even when we first started this off, Joseph, where you talked about part of this project came out of you trying to refute the things that you'd been taught in school or not been taught, right? And we know a lot of this you talk about this in the book as well, a lot of this comes out of lost cause ideology, right? Which not only permeated in the South, but became a national phenomenon, thanks to films like Birth of a Nation and other things, right? And Gone with the Wind. Lost cause nostalgia is pretty much all Americana. And we are living at this time where it almost seems if it's not a lost cause, people are trying to find ways not to talk about slavery, not to talk about this history that makes people uncomfortable. So for both of you, and you kind of just pointed this out, but I'd love to go further, how you see this project and as a book to refute both this persistent mythology of the lost cause, which has permeated so much of our popular culture and history, as well as a refutation of those today who are trying to silence, right? Who are trying to dictate which histories should be told.
Well, I want to thank Herb. He can talk more on this, for checking those blind spots, for making sure this book is as factual as we could. Our research proved that it could be. But I also see, this book as I stated earlier, that pushback. One thing that Herb and I talked about just today, we've got to sit down and compile that list of these professors that we know, you being on that list, but you kind of already doing your part to help spread the word. We got to get the word out to those professors. If they get banned or if they get restricted in telling these stories, we're not subject to that. And this book can continue to be that voice. And our social media footprint that the Slave Dwelling Project has, can help be part of that pushback. But it's got to be based on research, and that's where Herb came in to assist.
Well, this book is getting out there. The publishers, Hachette Books group in New York, they have put a lot of money in the promotion of this book. They've invested in having a video produced. This book is in all of the Barnes and Nobles around the country. We are talking about it here locally. We've been to Connecticut to talk about this book. But I think the more people read it and the more people share this book, and other books like it, I think that people will begin to see and begin to understand that this is a history that can't be denied. We are in very, very early stages right now in conversations with two different groups. One person who thinks that this book could be adapted into a play, and another group thinks that this book can be used to create a documentary. So it's gaining momentum, and I think, thank you, Dexter, thank you, Omar, for being one of those many concentric ripples that are beginning to spread across the country. And we want people to read it and enjoy it and be educated and learn something new as we have learned things new in the research of this book. And I must say, this is Joe's story. He spent all those nights on all those hard floors and all those uncomfortable places. I only spent 3 nights, twice at Magnolia and once at Mount Vernon. And I must say that, and each time I'm laying there on the floor in my sleeping bag, and I'm thinking, if I had been an enslaved person, I wouldn't be going to sleep. I'd be trying to figure out a way to get the heck away from here. So, and I didn't worry about the bugs. There are some bugs and, there's other creatures, but, after a while you fall asleep and you wake up and the sun is up and you say, that wasn't that bad. Yeah, so.
So I don't know how much time we have. I know we only have a few more minutes left, and I think Umar will give me the heads up, but I do see some other questions here. And so I have a question for Mallory. Mallory asks, do you find that these plantations are starting to reinterpret their sites as far as changing the narrative that enslaved people are happy, well taken care of, and quote unquote part of the family that are prevalent at some of these places? If not, are you hopeful that will change soon? And I will tag on to Mallory's question. I think this would be a great time to bring up something you brought up at the end there, and that is the Airbnb situation.
Yeah.
At the end of the book.
Yeah. A lot of the plantations are historic sites, antebellum sites, are sites that once enslaved people. They're doing a better job with the narrative and changing the narrative whenever necessary. And most of the time it is necessary. Or just to be inclusive. They're coming across that information, that archival information that they always had. You just got to look at it differently. If somebody wrote a letter about an enslaved person, disciplining it, an enslaved person may have run away. You may have just acquired some enslaved people. A lot of the enslavers went bankrupt. You go bankrupt, there are all kinds of records out there that talks about them, property being seized and the property listed. There are names of people on there listed as property. Again, I talked about those telltales out there, the fingerprints in the bricks, the marks in the beams, the indentions in the graveyard. And then there are archaeologists who help us put the meat on the bones and help us fill that void in telling that story that we need to tell about our enslaved ancestors. They're the archivists, that limited information that is out there. They help find that information. And of course, you can't deny that DNA. Jefferson found that out. Jefferson's descendants, I should say, found that out. You can't deny that DNA. So the evidence is there. We know how to read it better now. And when I say we, I mean Black folks. We can tell our own story now. Once upon a time, that wasn't the case. We had to rely on what the victors told us, and the victors made themselves look good by telling lies. I had no clue when I was being educated that 12 of our former presidents were slave owners, 25 signers of our Constitution were slave owners, 41 signers of our Declaration of Independence were slave owners, Supreme Court justices, slave owners. And I don't even talk about today. That's another whole subject as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. That's not why we're here. But those things those dots can be connected in the fact that, as a nation, we started out as a deficit. We started out with a deficit, as in, people say that the first sin of this nation was enslaving people. I have to disagree. I have to say the first sin of this nation was purging natives, and then enslaving people. I think that'll, number two in my book, the way I define how this nation was founded. But the evidence is there, and we could read it better, that we being us, people who I see on the screen that share the same DNA.
So as we come close here to the end, what is it? So it's the book here. Everybody, make sure they go out and get this book. Great read. What is it you hope that people are going to take away from this, right? What do you think people can do who are interested in this, who want to know more, or want to understand this experience? What advice do you both give?
Well, this book is an experience. I'm a person. I'm down in the trenches. I do what I do, and I love, I love doing it. I love talking to people. I like being in front of people talking. I'm hoping that this book will let folks know that it's okay to gather with folks who don't look and think like you and have those difficult conversations, like we do around those campfires. When we talk about slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation, white supremacy and white privilege and Confederate monuments and weddings on plantations. And of course, now the elephant in the room is anti-CRT and anti-woke. I'm hoping this book will let folks know that it's okay to gather in the same place and talk about those things.
Well, and Joe may have touched on this earlier, we hope also that this book will take some Northern folks out of that comfortable place that they thought they could live in, and deny the fact and point to the South as it was your problem, it's your fault, your ancestors' fault. No, it was it was also it was a countrywide problem. The other thing is I have a friend here in Charleston who's an avid reader, and when she got the book, she started reading it. I called her a few days later, and because I thought she'd be finished with it, but she said she couldn't. She had to put it down because it made her mad, and she had to go off and cool off, and then she'd come back to it. So I hope this book makes you mad, and you take some action, and you do something, and you share these stories with older people who don't know it, and the younger people who are yet to know it. So that's what we hope.
That's right. History should not make you comfortable. I have a t-shirt I wore today with those exact words. Joseph, Herb, thank you so much for this discussion. It was great. Again, everyone, the book, I'm gonna keep showing it. Umar, I know, has put a link there. Thank you everyone for joining us today on this Thursday evening to talk about this. I really do hope that I would love to see this as a documentary. So I can't wait to see Ken Burns direct this documentary, and I can watch it on PBS American Experience in the near future. So thank you both for this, and thank you everyone. And thank you, Omar, for putting this on at the Mark Twain House as well.
Yes, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation and book. And thanks to you, Dexter, for being a moderator this evening. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right, everybody.